Hi, everybody. My name is Nairobi, and I am the host of the Power to the Flower podcast. And this is episode 6. Welcome. We're going to be talking about the historical landmark legislation on cannabis policy in the United States. We've talked about the importance of policy and the importance of people understanding their agency in changing policy. We also talked about state policy, federal policy as a whole, and we even talked about local policy too. We also got a perspective from an entrepreneur who was operating in the space trying to make moves for himself and for the people that work alongside him. With this particular episode, I want to do something a little bit different. I want to go way back into the 1800s and even into the early 1900s in the United States on specific issues that are relative still today. That main issue being the way that we choose to make policy and how that negatively could have affected communities like my own. One piece of legislation that I want to start off with is the Marijuana Tax of 1937. The 1937 Marijuana Tax Act effectively made a federal ban on cannabis, but more specifically, they heavily taxed and regulated cannabis because prior to that 1937 act, cannabis was used relatively for medicinal purposes as well as hemp industry purposes to create, paper and things like that. And even there was a hemp car, if you didn't know. Ford actually did that one. And there was also recreational purposes as well that we use cannabis for in the United States, but with very, very little regulation. So the Tax Act created strict regulations on consuming cannabis, but also the sale of cannabis became much, much more difficult. And businesses that were to engage in the sale of cannabis were heavily taxed, much kind of like today, if we think about it. But prior to the 1937 Act, when cannabis was legal and there wasn't as much regulation, what we had before was an unregulated market in the 1800s. It started around kind of the Civil War. And so in the Civil War, back in the 1800s, there were folks that were using it to cope, with pain and with other issues, even recreationally in the war. And they were specifically using opiates, kind of like today. Once this legislation was passed, and years later, in 1937, when the Marijuana Taxation Act was introduced and passed in Congress, the United States saw a persecution of specific people. And why I say the words persecution, some people might say that's too big of a word to use in this context, but no, because there were communities that were literally ostracized for using cannabis because even if they were using it for their own recreational purposes, as was commonplace in prior to 1937, and even at that time, there were certain people that were persecuted just because they wanted to consume, much like today. So some of you may be wondering, well, what happened, Nairobi? Why did the Marijuana Taxation Act of 1937 even become illegal in the first place? Well, it's because there was a piece of landmark court case information that went before the United States Supreme Court, and then they deemed it unconstitutional because they argued in the court. It was Leary versus the United States. They argued in the court that in order for that person to have registered the cannabis that they had purchased in Mexico, they would have had to have reported it as an illegal activity and therefore incriminating themselves. So it violates the clause of self-incrimination. And so this was really, really cool because now we have the Marijuana Taxation Act is overturned and therefore deemed unconstitutional to tax people in such a way because it violates that privilege of self-incrimination, forcing a person inherently to snitch on themselves, right? Like saying okay, well, hi, federal government, I'm going to report the taxes of my illegal cannabis that I purchased. And therefore, either way, once you report, you're doing an illegal activity. And therefore, the way that it's set up, it was meant for you to be set up. And therefore, the person who went before the court argued that this violated that privilege of self-incrimination. And so we want to be able, privilege against self-incrimination, I'm sorry. And so we want to be able to have reasons when we create legislation that actually makes sense, right, to enact and for people to follow. But this was clearly not one of them. However, once that legislation was overturned by way of the United States Supreme Court decision, there was a new law that was enacted, and that new law is what is referred to commonly today as the CSA, or the Controlled Substances Act. The propaganda used at this time was really, really horrible. There were even images and movies that were all correlated to reefer madness, or during this time, that really specifically said that if you use cannabis, you would turn into some sort of wild animal and that you wouldn't be able to control yourself, which is nothing further from the truth. As we speak right now, I am currently under the influence of cannabis, and I think I can speak pretty well, and I certainly don't seem wild. But what it is that there are certain pieces of stigma that really stick over time, especially if you're repeating it over and over. And that happens by way of a propaganda campaign. Propaganda campaigns are, for those of you who don't know, are literal images and distorted facts, or if not facts, are distorted truths, which are usually lies, right? Lies spewed out in terms of artistry, right? You can do it by way in, art itself, canvases, if you will, or even in movies, or even just storytelling, right? So there's a lot that goes into a propaganda campaign, commercials, things like that, newspaper articles. This propaganda campaign against Mexican Americans specifically, and Black Americans specifically, never went away, right? And it was translated into, later on, the rise in private prisons in the United States. So we see that it's all really correlated, but we're not really fully getting the full scope of cannabis drug policy if we only focus on the Marijuana Taxation Act in 1937. What we do know is that there were origins to that tax. So like I said, propaganda, and so it would create what was now believed in people's mind as a truth. And so this became a stigma. So from the rising concerns and from the propaganda, there were other things that came about that really caused the push for the Marijuana Taxation Act of 1937. The other piece there is the economic interest, because we are in a capitalist society here in the United States. So much of our policies usually have an economic benefit or an economic interest prior to being instilled into legislation. And usually that comes at a cost of maybe a rising industry, or maybe something that would have prevented some other person, an interested party, maybe a lobbyist or something like that, from having their policies go forth. So what I mean by that is, there were literal other industries that were threatened by hemp and by cannabis itself, the plant. And so they outlawed it. And then on top of that, they were creating stigma, saying that the reason why they needed to outlaw it is because of these bad people. And oftentimes people of color became scapegoats to the use of marijuana, even though it was already existing in an unregulated drug market prior to. And not only that, it was being sold and distributed. Secondly, the economic interests came as a result of those industry leaders in, the newspaper industry, who were using mostly wood to get their paper, right? And even the chemical industry from DuPont. So I'm specifically naming DuPont, who was one of the proponents as to why they stopped using hemp in many of the commercialized spaces, because he was arguing on behalf of his economic interests. And there's a interesting correlation between Henry Anslinger and all of these other folks that were interested parties in seeing cannabis or hemp go away. And so that's something that we shouldn't take lightly, because it is something that we see a lot happening in our government in terms of policy. We talk about these billionaires who have these agendas, and it has not been anything different from the past. This is how it's always been. There have been people that have agendas, and so they'll push it and infringe it upon the US government and then use different communities as a scapegoat to be able to then enact a policy and use it as a need for law and order in the country. Whether it's immigration, whether it's cannabis, whether it's any other issue, even healthcare or women's access to abortion, right? There are so many issues that all kind of stem from the same place, economic interests. Then we find a negative party to blame it on, right? And then there's a reason to enact policy. And so what happens is now you're creating a system, but they were successful in arresting people and stripping people from their lives, stripping people from the opportunity to actually be members of our society, to even vote. They were stripped away from these opportunities because once cannabis became illegal after the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, we now were confronted with people that were being heavily arrested and put into prison for the simple possession and sale of cannabis. And there is where the problem was created. Although the Marijuana Taxation Act only taxed cannabis and made it much more difficult to actually, purchase and have an industry on, that was not the last of the aggressive cannabis policies in the US. And do you want to know why? Well, because right before, in 1969, right before the 1970 Act was introduced, the Supreme Court deemed that the 1937 law was ruled illegal. It was overturned by the United States. There was a man who went ahead and challenged in the United States Supreme Court this particular ban. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 created a scheduling system by which marijuana was now in the same scheduling as LSD and heroin. Yes, that was in 1970. Today we are in the year 2024, and that is still the case. Cannabis has not been descheduled nor rescheduled since 1970 when this act was created. And so the CSA established this drug policy which classified all the Schedule 1 substances and then Schedule 2 and then Schedule 3. Schedule 1 indicated the highest potential for adult substance abuse, right? And it has no accepted medical use and is not acknowledged for its medical benefits, which obviously, if you know much about endocannabinoids or if you know much about cannabis itself, if you are a user, you can probably self-testify that it has helped your health, and it certainly has helped mine. And so it had far-reaching consequences being just classified as a Schedule 1 drug, because now we created a legislation that further solidified its federal illegalization despite something being overturned not even a year later, right? The 1937 Act created the stigma that existed for, decades, and now we see still has its effect on today's common policy on cannabis. So the 1970s Controlled Substance Act did not just the scheduling, but it also further solidified its illegitimacy in the eyes of the United States federal law. This led to the 1973, 3 years later, the establishment of the DEA. So if you know anything about the FBN, which was the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, that agency was led by Henry Anslinger during much of its tenure. And then in the 1970s, right, that establishment of the DEA was used to further intensify the drug enforcement, right? The drug enforcement that was happening in the 70s was led much by Nixon and even Henry Anslinger still at this point in time. So you can see that the crafters or the founders, much like we have people who founded the Constitution and how we still abide by it today, these documents are nothing short of very, very serious. I mean, when you create a legislation or when you push for policies that have impacts, most policies will have impacts on some communities, but other policies may just be completely blatantly targeting communities. And that's certainly what this policy was doing. So the 1970s Controlled Substance Act created that schedule and then intensified the government's efforts to combat the drug use via the DEA that was created in 1973, 3 years later. So now we have, at the same timing of the 70s and Nixon's administration, there is, the undertones of horrible politics. There's the Democratic politics and then the Republican politics. And if anybody knows anything about Nixon and the same people that were running his campaign and who some of those people were inspired by that are running, Donald Trump's campaign, a lot of the same messaging that you hear is kind of like what you still hear today, except now the conversations have shifted a little bit because the Democrats have kind of honed in a lot on social equity and, making it a fair and equitable space for us to repair the harms that were happening by the war on drugs. But now the Republicans are kind of using cannabis as a way to say that it helps veterans in regards to cannabis drug policy. It's really interesting and has taken a lot of twists and turns. But by, of course, from the 70s all the way to the 80s, the official war on drugs era begun in a way that led to mass incarceration. Initiated originally by President Nixon, we now had a continued effort by the following president, Ronald Reagan. The issues go well beyond drug policy, but we see that even just like trickle-down economics, the war on drugs was also a gimmick. It was not something that was effective at all, and instead created generational ramifications of people who were targeted and effectively removed from society. The war on drugs was created to criminalize Black and brown communities, and never was there an intent to be able to create an industry that we see today. And I'm happy that those of us like me that are involved can stick it right to his desires, right? Where we can say, you try to keep us out, but we're here and we belong here. Even more so now that there has been a historical criminalization of people in our communities. So it's important to understand that while we're seeing the rise in prison systems from the 80s all the way to the 2000s, we now get it. There were policies that were created to do that. And there were policies that were created with racial undertones from the jump. So I want to read off some facts and some figures that are correlated to the prison growth or the growth of incarceration in general, right? And the disproportionate impacts to Black and brown communities. I want you all to know and understand what I know, and just to put context to the matter. So in 1980, the total prison population was approximately 330,000 people. By 1990, that number of federal and state inmates reached a record high of 771,243 people, making an increase of 134% from 1980. So that's a jump. 134% is a jump. That is from 1980 to 1990. Obviously, with the CSA establishing the federal criminalization to its maximum degree, there were laws that were created that were going to penalize folks to give them the maximum sentencing. And so you have now policies that are targeting people of color, but then you have the sentencing that is giving longer times and periods for people to stay in prison. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Why would the government want for Black people specifically and brown people specifically to serve time in prison for longer periods of time by way of legislation? So If the number of inmates have increased, then likely the number of prisons have increased. By 2000, right, the total prison population had grown to approximately 1,381,892, with 91,612 women in state or federal prisons, accounting for 6.6% of all prison inmates. Do you want to know how much of that was disproportionately Black and Hispanic? Black men, as a general rule of thumb, since this has been the case, the statistics that have come out of here are disgusting, and I say this because it really is so saddening to see, our brothers and sisters struggling through this and still going through it despite having a legal cannabis industry. So, Black men are 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men. Let me just repeat that. Black men are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men. That's impactful. And it's a punch to the gut because we know that this is not something that is a normal statistic. There is clearly a racial bias there because we know there has to be. And especially if you live that experience, you know that there's no denying it, right? And Latinx men, or specifically Latino men or Hispanic men, are 2.5 times more likely to get incarcerated more than white men, right? So that it's still disproportionately Black men who are mostly in prison. And there are Black Latinos, right? But there are some folks who just identify as one race or one ethnicity or whatever specific demographic they identify as, and that's how typically data gets reported. And there's also people that get misclassified in their race just for out of pure ignorance on behalf of the person who's doing the classification, right? Or the report itself. So we know that there is bias all around. But this is obvious a disproportionate impact. It's something that we all should be able to look at and say, this needs to change. At the same time, there's still gaps from our own personal life experiences and understanding to the legislators who are actually creating policy, because if they knew and understood the impacts and the ways that these policies would have affected our communities, they would effectively put an end to it if they could. And they can. Okay, they can. And we have to remind ourselves of that because this podcast, although it says power to the flower, we really believe in the essence of who smokes the flower in the first place, the people. So if you understand yourself and your agency while changing policy, you need to know and understand that there is agency even within the elected official to change that policy as well. Though in many instances they have to work together, there are some folks that if you're in an executive position like a mayor or a president, right, there are certain executive decisions you can make. The president, by way of executive orders, and even a mayoral elected official can do the same thing as well. And so that's really important for us to know and understand, because we can't do anything as a response anymore. We have to actually continue to keep pushing and know exactly how to ask for what we need, which is real structural change on the policy level. So not only did we see that rise in disproportionate impact of, from Black men and even the rise of incarceration, but the rise of private prisons themselves grew significantly from that time period. So from the 1980s all the way to the 2000s, there were over 100 private prisons that had increased. Specifically in the 2000s, there were over 100 that were housing 87,000 inmates at that point. But we know that specifically the number of prisons has increased. And so that gets to show us that there's actually something for us to be mindful of. Even though there was a rise, we know that there was a rise in prisons, but there wasn't even that many, to the point where they were documenting how many prisons there were, private prisons. And the only reason we know that there was a rise is because there had to have been in order to house a lot of these inmates. for all of that increase in time. And so it becomes really difficult for us to make it malleable and acceptable because it's hard to really accept. And so now we're at a point where we have to choose new legislation. We have to know and understand the historical context of each of these pieces of legislation and move past the past and go into the future thinking of everyone and the benefit of all, especially those who have been disproportionately impacted. So the good news is that there was legislation that was introduced and passed afterwards that created a marketplace for cannabis, both on the medicinal level, but also on the recreational level. And so in 1996, California recognized that, you know what, whatever, the federal government's going to do what they want, but Proposition 215 legalized medical cannabis in the state of California. And so cannabis on the medical level, hadn't been a thing anymore after the two passages of the Marijuana of 1937 Act and the Controlled Substances Act in 1970. But of course, this created a really unique opportunity for other states and other areas in the United States, not just the states, but territories and things like that, to be able to look at their policies and see whether or not they wanted to change their own policy as well. So by 2012, though, Colorado and Washington became the first to not just decriminalize cannabis, but to legalize recreational cannabis in their states. So recreational and medicinal are obviously two different purposes, although some would argue that they're kind of one and the same. But for medicinal purposes, you're also, you're trying to solve a problem or a specific symptom you're trying to heal in your body and of your health. Whereas with the recreational piece, you're smoking out of your own free time just because you like to smoke weed. It's kind of like when you drink for fun or something like that. Recreational is different than medical. And so because of that, different bills were introduced to kind of like soft launch cannabis in each of these states. Some of them introduced cannabis as medicine first before introducing recreational, like we did here in the state of Massachusetts. However, in 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first to legalize recreational cannabis. So in 2018, there's a new piece of legislation that, again, like we said in the beginning, there was a legislation that banned hemp, and that was the Marijuana Act of 1937 and the Controlled Substances Act later on. But what happened is that the hemp industry effectively became obsolete once marijuana as a whole was, heavily taxed in the 30s. And so you weren't seeing a development of hemp cars, even though Henry Ford had developed the first hemp car, right? You weren't seeing hemp used as rope anymore because other forms of industries were taking over to fill that space. And so now there's a whole dying of an industry. But with the Farm Bill in 2018, they were able to do something a little different. So the Farm Bill of 2018, it legalized the cultivation and the sale of hemp. And that's really important because when you cultivate, that means that you're growing the products. But when you're selling it, obviously that's two different things, to grow and to sell it. So some might even, just legalize and decriminalize, legalize one aspect but then decriminalize the other, but won't necessarily make it legal. In this case, it definitely freed up THC free cannabis, which is usually hemp or CBD in some way. But hemp itself is very free or low of THC content. And so the Farm Bill legalized the cultivation and the sale of hemp, and then it created an avenue for hemp sales to just kind of start and begin and thrive. And so now when you go to a gas station, or if you go somewhere, not necessarily a dispensary, but when you go somewhere like a store that sells this particular thing, it's called Delta 9 or Delta 8. Those are hemp-derived THC. People just get kind of confused by the THC content and what that does to the body. But At the same time, you are learning that there is a different derivative um, of hemp and also THC. So in 2018, that was really great because it created that industry again to kind of like revamp itself. But then in 2020, we wanted to see more changes, and that is no pun to this, but there was actually an act called the MORE Act, right? And so the MORE Act basically aimed to decriminalize cannabis in general on the federal level and to expunge certain cannabis related offenses. But even though it was passed by the House of Representatives, it didn't quite make it past the Senate. And so what happens is in Congress, and I explained this on episode 1 and 2, you have two structures, right? So you have Congress is a bicameral system, meaning there's two houses. There's the House and then there's the Senate. The House passes a bill and then it goes over to the Senate, and then the Senate passes it back over to the House for the final passage. They send it off. After that, once it's done and signed and agreed upon, they send it over to the president to sign off and create a bill. That's the short and sweet end of it. But because if one house doesn't pass it the first time, they will not get to the second pass before they can even send it over to the president or to the governor. But this then creates a level of discontentment because some people say, okay, well, we can pass it in the House, but not in the Senate. And so is there ever going to be a pathway to legalizing cannabis? Well, you can try and you can try and you can try. And then in the process, you're seeing different states that are legalizing as well. So now we're up to 38 states and territories in the United States. So what happens is once usually there's a hot button issue that makes it past a certain threshold of states or territories that have passed similar issues on the state level, then usually the federal level will take it up and make that legislative change. Though that has been seen in the past, it has taken them a very long time to kind of come around cannabis. As we have seen, we're dealing with decades worth of stigma that we're trying to undo. And so in efforts to do that, there has to be a lot of pushes, different types of pushes, whether it's a push on the federal level and on the state level and on the local level and, by way of like advocacy and all of these different things. There has to be strategy in everything that we do, but we have to be tactical in getting it done. And so in order to do that, you have to then continue to present even more bills or even be supportive of bills that exist. With 2020 and just 2021, since then, there have been more states that have passed legalization efforts. One of them, namely, being New York, which created a huge, huge marketplace. And now we're at a point where, it's 2024 and recent news, we've seen that obviously Joe Biden has called upon different governors to pardon simple possessions of cannabis, or just his general perspectives on pardoning in cannabis have been really welcoming to hear because it's on a federal level. And it's the president who's saying it, right? We talked a little bit earlier about executive orders and who can do those things. The president certainly can. So in order to change legislation, though, and to not deem something unconstitutional, we do have to pass it through the House and the Senate with careful review of making sure it's not unconstitutional and then creating new laws. And people get reinvigorated in terms of believing what is possible. And so the reason why it's super important for us to always look back is so that we're more prepared for what's coming ahead. And we have the tools and we understand what got us here in the first place, but also unraveling what is possible and to come in the future. So I'm really excited for what the future has to hold, but I know that more importantly, there's different pieces of legislation that we could be backing and we should be backing. Right now, there's an effort to deschedule, right? We talked about the Controlled Substances Act. If people were thinking on a more holistic level, maybe we'd call for a complete revisitation of the CSA, not just including cannabis, but there's probably other, substances in there that folks might think it shouldn't be at that level or whatever. But drug policy reform is incredibly controversial and not always is it successful, as we have seen by way of cannabis. So we have a lot to work on, but definitely it is a work that we could do all together if we're really willing to push for the common causes. So, with the historical wrap up of all of these cannabis policies, I want you all to take away those main points that I asked about earlier. What are these policies doing to communities of color? And more importantly, why did those effects really go as far as they did, where people were criminalized and there were, maximum offenses and things like that? Why are our communities constantly being berated and not given opportunities? So, if we're thinking about creating new policy, we have to think about how to repair historical errors on behalf of the United States government and correcting that as we can from the state level, local level, all the way up until we get the federal level passed. So, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you did take away a lot of information. And then just do your own personal research. I mean, if there's any particular policy issue that stood out to you that you want to ask more about, I really highly recommend that you take up your own personal knowledge and search all that you need to get familiar. I will post a book in the slide of the post when I do post the video, but I want folks to be able to read a book called Marijuana, ironically, but it's like the policy overview of all of these different historical policies, along with some suggested changes in current policy now. So, with that, thank you so much for listening to episode 6. This is our wrap up. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Reach out to me through Instagram, which is where I'm most accessible on the podcast. And if you have any other particular thoughts or anybody that you would like to see on the podcast to talk about policy, please send me a direct message and I will get back to you as soon as possible. And to the one lawmaker who took heed to President Joe Biden's call for action on cannabis simple possession pardoning, thank you, Governor Maura Healey, on behalf of Massachusetts residents and the cannabis industry, and more specifically, on behalf of those who've been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. This is so, so important, and it's something that should be celebrated because, frankly, it's about time. So thank you again to her and to her team. Thank you to everyone who's pushing for these policies all around. And shout out to those who are pushing for this one landmark bill that I'm hoping that we get to see all around, for the Clean Slate Act. So there are clean slate bills that are going on throughout the whole United States, and in Massachusetts in particular. It's being led by a coalition of folks, and most importantly, led by Leslie Creedle, who is super dope and is always out here helping, people who have been impacted by the justice system, negatively impacted by the justice system, to get housing. And she does that by way of her nonprofit, Justice for Housing, and has helped so many people. I am just in awe of the community's advocacy, and specifically those who are working to change the narrative, because they see, just like I see, that some things start where policy ends. Where policy even begins in thought, our communities are affected. And so we need to make sure that everything we do it with the community in mind. Thank you so much for listening to episode 6. Till next time, next episode, we'll be talking a little bit more about the industry itself. And I'm going to be actually inviting another guest. So stay tuned, and I'll see you till next time. Bye.